What's up guys, welcome back, and I'm back with a new budget build. This time the budget is $200 and I was quite surprised on how this PC performs in games. Normally at this price you can buy an Optiplex and upgrade it, but I wanted to go custom since I was planning to use a much nicer PC case as well as I had some parts from my $110 build. In case you missed it, I will put a link at the top right corner. Just to note, this build is using used parts since it's quite difficult to put a new PC for $200 that can play modern games. Going used, I was able to achieve quite a good value for our money and a few nice features like an SSD and a quite powerful dedicated graphics. So, this is not an exact guide on how to build a PC. It's more of a showcase on what performance you can expect in games at this price point, and that you can do your research, hunt some nice second-hand parts locally, and you do not need say $1000 to build your first gaming PC. In case you are interested in a similar videos, be sure to subscribe and click that bell button so you don't miss upcoming videos. Also, by subscribing you help my channel grow and make even more interesting content for you guys. I really appreciate it, and let's get started! As I mentioned previously, I will use some of the core components from my $110 build I made a few weeks ago. So we have an i5-2400 CPU, 8GB of DDR3 memory, 120GB SSD and a 600W power supply. Basically, there are two graphics cards that give you tons of performance on 1080p but costs relatively low, and these two choices are RX 570 and RX 580. I was afraid that RX 580 will be quite too much for the system to handle, so I went for RX 570. The seller wanted $70, but since it was really dusty one, I managed to get it for $65. I used my air compressor to blow all the dust, but even then there were tons of them inside of a heatsink. Well, it's a toothbrush time! Reapplied the thermal paste and it was ready to go. Obviously, I needed a case for this build, and so my choice was E-Shield from Deepcool. Recently I made an unboxing video of this case since it's one of the best tempered glass choices you can have for around €30 or $35. And here I've listed all the parts with prices I managed to get. I just didn't include 6 LED fans into a final price, since it's completely not necessary to spend another $27 on fans, and it's quite a bit of the overkill for such a budget build. Even though one fan costs only around $4.50, you could easily stick to one included case fan or add one more at most. But I had these fans lying around and wanted to make it with a little blink. Well, I hope I managed to do that. Let's switch to some benchmarks. Just to remind, I will be comparing my $200 build in some of the games with a $110 and $130 builds I did previously. All builds are basically the same spec, meaning i5-2400, H61 motherboard, 8GB of DDR3 RAM and 120GB SSD. The only difference is a graphics card I'm using in each of the builds. The cheapest PC got GTX 650, $130 PC got GTX 650 Ti, and $200 build is using one of the best value for the money video cards, RX 570. In case you want to get RX 570 for yourself, I will leave a link in the description below. Regarding benchmarks, I'm using the same settings in all esports titles, so it would be a fair comparison. Though on a $200 build, you can definitely play around with much higher game settings and still get a decent FPS. First up we have CSGO, and here I've got 206 average FPS using competitive settings, and we can see quite a nice FPS scaling between these builds, even though 1% lows are quite similar. But in a high FPS and low setting scenario, I've started to see some of the CPU bottleneck, since the GPU usage was bouncing from 0 to 90% all the time. Next up we have League of Legends, and here things got really strange. All three builds performed nearly identical. Well, at first I thought CPU is doing some kind of a trick, but then I've noticed I get in between 200 and 300 FPS at the beginning of a match, and then after 10 seconds or so GPU starts to downclock itself, and its core clock and memory clock speeds are running around 50% only. CPU utilization is also between 40 and 50%. So I googled a bit and found quite some posts from lots of players regarding similar issues, and it seems the game is poorly optimized. And so you can have a pretty close FPS numbers on a budget and on a high-end system. Anyway, 120 average FPS is more than enough, so all good here. Fortnite. As I've expected, it's quite a huge difference compared to other builds. And so I've managed to get 138 FPS on average and 48 FPS as 1% lows. And I have noticed the same behavior when testing CSGO. GPU utilization was all over the place, and the CPU was locked more or less at 95% usage. Frame rates in Rocket League were rocking hard. On the highest settings I've got 158 FPS on average and 98 FPS as 1% lows, so you get a really good experience on this $200 gaming build. But I've noticed it depends a lot from an arena you're playing in. And in one you can end up with 180, but in another one with 140 average FPS. Okay, from here I will present more of the newer games, so the comparison between the budget second-hand builds is done. Since esports games requires high FPS, it seems that i5 2400 is not quite keeping up with an RX 570, at least in these high frame rate games. And so, with a faster CPU, say i7 3770, you should get even higher FPS in those titles. Don't get me wrong, i5 2400 and RX 570 is almost the perfect match, but you could get away with a bit cheaper GPU and have pretty much the same performance here. But let's see how $200 gaming PC performs in some of the last year's AAA titles. First up we have Shadow of a Tomb Raider. Using high settings preset I've got 55 FPS on average and 34 FPS as 1% lows. I suggest playing around with a high and medium settings in order to boost your FPS a bit and go above 60. But it's definitely nice to see you can use high settings on a $200 PC. One of the most demanding games, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. High settings might be too much, and you should consider using a medium preset, since running a benchmark at 1080p gave me 49 FPS on average. Next up we have a Far Cry New Dawn. On 1080p with ultra settings I've got just below 60 FPS on average. It should be playable, having in mind I've used the highest settings available. Performance is really good in a battle royale game Apex Legends. 101 FPS on average and 61 FPS as 1% lows will provide quite a smooth gameplay for most of the casual players. Sure, in case you are into competitive gaming, it might be too little, especially if you are using 120 or higher refresh rate monitor. But in general, having in mind it's a battle royale game with a huge map, I would say a performance is really nice. Moving on, here we have Hitman 2, and I've tested 2 included benchmark cities in this title. I've got 54 FPS on average and 22 FPS as 1% lows. Just like in a few other titles, I would recommend mixing up medium with high settings, just to boost your FPS a bit and still get quite a good visuals and gaming experience. I know GTA 5 has been released quite some time ago, but I've decided to include it as well. having in mind it's still popular and guys with a similar PC setup probably would like to play this game. And so I've got 70 FPS on average and 53 FPS as 1% loss. Well, before making this video I was quite sure i5-2400 could still handle RX 570 and it would be a good match. But at least in half of the benchmarks, graphics cards were forced to wait for a CPU. This suggests you could get away with a slower GPU and it means a bit cheaper build. Or you could upgrade your CPU to i7-3770 and that would improve your frame rate in esports and other CPU intense titles for sure. Anyway, I think it's one of the best combo to get into PC gaming for cheap and build your first gaming rig. And you do not need to spend thousands of dollars to get 60 FPS on high to medium settings even on a AAA games. Next, I'm planning to build a mid-range system for around $1000 for a high frame rate 1080p gaming. Stay tuned and please subscribe, since in this way you will help to grow this channel and bring even more content to you guys. And see you soon!